Good afternoon, everybody. It's 12:45, Sunday, the 22nd of June, 2025. Welcome to a live paint along with me, Rory, at Culloden Painting Studio. I hope that everybody's excited about watching some painting. I think my phone screen seems to be stuck in vertical mode. Let's see if I can change that to horizontal. I'm just gonna have to go for a vertical stream. It may just need to be a vertical one, but hopefully there's enough of a picture there for everybody to see. So I have got some AB miniatures 18mm Prussians from 1806. So quite a different uniform to the 1813 to 1815 that everybody's used to. A lot more colourful, a lot more in common with the 7 Years' War than the rest of the Napoleonic era. And today I'm going to be doing some painting. It's going to be sort of a discussion on how to batch paint more so than a guide on start to finish. I think I'm only going to stream for about an hour, and there's a battalion of 24 here to do, and I can't do that in an hour. But we'll lay down some base colours and talk about the batch painting process. They were primed white. I've already used some Vallejo dark Prussian blue to do the jackets on the officer and NCOs here. And I'll probably start off with the dark Prussian blue and paint some jackets. If anybody wants to drop in the chat what they're painting at the moment or how they go about doing batch painting themselves, I'm all ears. And just talk about general hobby stuff as we go today. A lot of the techniques for 28mm figures work on 18mm. There's nothing that special about them in that regards. Sometimes need to be a bit more daring with the highlights and shadows. So need to perhaps pick a brighter tone for a highlight than you would on a 28mm figure, or a darker shade for the shadows. And that's just because at distance, in order to be able to tell the different colors on a model apart, you sometimes need a higher contrast between light and dark. And most of the time with 18mm figures, it's the look of the whole army, not the individual model. So these are our clients' figures. So thank you to them for commissioning me to paint them, and also for agreeing to let me paint them on stream. Hopefully if they watch things back later, they'll be happy with the process. So there's quite a few areas on this drummer that need to be avoided with the brush if possible. I think when I'm doing the base coats, I'm fairly rough and ready, but I do try to paint within the lines because it just means there's a bit less work tidying up later. So I was mentioning earlier, about the difference in uniforms for these 1806 Prussians to the post 1813 period. Most obvious one, I think, is the headwear. Still wearing bicorns at this point, as opposed to shakos, which come later. The cut of the jacket is different as well. We've got coloured lapels, which varied by regiment. The cuffs are a different shape if that's your sort of level of button counting you want to go to. And as well as the uniform, the sort of the drill and the tactics that the Prussian army used in 1806 really were out of date. They were successful in the 7 Years' War in the mid 1750s to 60s. And by the time Napoleon rolled around and decided that attacking quickly was more important, the Prussians were still trying to outmaneuver and find strategic advantages. And then at Jena in 1806, the Prussians kind of got pasted. So a couple of comments. Thanks for watching. Thomas Martin says, morning, I'm painting Austro-Hungarian piano miniatures scaled up 25%. Yeah, the piano Wargames miniatures are superb. I was recently doing plenty of Austrians from piano Wargames. I was doing them to donate to a charity game. When you say scaled up 25%, is that starting at 28mm and then going even bigger? Would that take them all the way up to 54mm, or is it more sort of the 40mm? And Ace Jake Dingle says, yo, that's so cool. Thanks for tuning in. I'm glad that painting on camera looks interesting and cool to other people. The 18mm figures from AB are superbly proportioned and sculpted. The amount of detail that's packed in on these small figures is quite incredible. I like the Napoleonic figures that they do. They also do some World War II stuff, which I think sort of gets closer to 20mm, 1/72. I haven't painted any of those, but I think they are a good option if you do World War II in that scale. And the Napoleonic range is really extensive. We've got this 1806 Prussians, which not many people tend to game, but they've got lots of miniatures for the minor nations, and even where there's slight uniform variations. Recently, they put out some Italian Guard dragoons, which you could have just used regular old French dragoons for, but the slight differences have been accounted for. Thomas Martin says, yes, pulls them up about 40mm, really brings out the detail. So talk about 3D printed piano Wargames figures there, and the advantages of technology lets you scale them to whatever size you want to paint them at. I'm glad that you've watched some of my videos and find them hopefully helpful for uniform stuff. It's funny actually, when I'm talking about painting Austrians, I've painted plenty of Austrians in the German uniform, as it were, helmets and shakos from both the sort of early and later period. But actually, I haven't painted any Hungarian troops with their lovely blue trousers. Or Grenzer. Somebody was talking about Grenz units on the last stream I did. I don't have an Austrian force of my own, so it's really only what I've done as commission work that I have experience with in the Austrian Napoleonic army of the period. But things like 1806 Prussians is not something I would have ever painted myself. So definitely one of the advantages of painting other people's models is that you get a wide range of experience painting all sorts. I think that if anybody wants information on the uniform varieties of the 1806 Prussians, the Perry Miniatures website is a good start. And in their articles section, they've got a few pages which have some nice illustrated diagrams of what the different facings are for the different units. And as well as sort of collars, cuffs, and lapels, there's little pom-poms on everybody's bicorn, one at the top, and then also two little ones at the edges there and there. And I'm not sure if it's completely, there's no duplicates amongst the regiments, but there's certainly different colors of pom-pom per regiment. And without that simple guide from the Perrys, I think it would be a nightmare to track down all the information in written text. If you're interested, this is the 2nd Battalion of the 18th Konig Regiment. And quite interestingly, it looks like the rest of the regiments all have red turnbacks, but the Konig Regiment has sort of a rosy, winey coloured facings, and that includes the turnbacks. If anybody knows better than the Perrys and wants to correct me on that, now would be a good time. All right, second base. So my general batch painting setup for an 18mm battalion is to do all 24 models at once. If it's 36, I might split it into two 18 strong batches. I don't know if there's any particular reason why I decided to do all 24. It just kind of feels right. I am using tongue depressors or big ice lolly sticks. And I use little glue dots, which are like self-adhesive tacky dots. Pop 8 dots down on the stick and then plonk your man down. There probably are more ergonomic ways of holding this. I think some people probably do use the Citadel paint holder to hold each lolly stick if they're doing it this way. This is good enough for me. And I prime everything on the stick and then go to the painting. I've been generally trying to use ColorForge primers recently. I think they're good value and they have a nice range of colors. But I think things like their white one and their sort of off-whites are pretty similar in finish to Games Workshop's Wraithbone Grey Seer. So they work well with the contrast type paints. I think the off-white is called White Bone and the very light grey is called Ghoul Grey from ColorForge. It says it's ColorForge Matte White. It's a good smooth finish. I had a nice window for spray painting about 10 days ago when it was nice and warm up here in Scotland, but before it got too hot. It's annoying when it's too hot and dry because the paint dries while it's on the way to the model and it leaves a speckly rough finish. Or if it's like today when it's far too humid and keeps threatening to rain a lot, then the paint tends to be disturbed by water in the air and again leaves a poor finish on the model. It has been suggested by many people that I get myself an airbrush, but I just do not have the setup at home that would allow me to have an airbrush and extractor and everything else set up. I'm in the corner of a bedroom doing this. In the chat, Thomas Martin says, researching the units and correct colors can really take time. Yeah, I mean, I think for a lot of people, that is half the fun of historical wargaming, is really immersing themselves in the history and then taking that knowledge and transferring it into your models for the tabletop. I find as a commission painter, I need to have like a wide base of knowledge, but not necessarily a very deep one. And mine is more focused on my knowledge base is more focused on what uniforms at what times, which means that when people talk about the personalities of the era or the campaigns or the battles, I don't have that much knowledge. So sometimes I feel a bit fraudulent when people start talking about the left wing at Talavera or something like that, and I don't really follow. But at the same time, I guess I do have a bit more knowledge on uniforms than people who have that specialist knowledge would. But you can get out of historical wargaming whatever you want. Some people just want to put toy soldiers down the table and blast away each other, and that is fine as well. That's one thing I don't particularly like is gatekeeping in the hobby. Everybody gets out of it what they want, and we shouldn't look down our noses at anybody who has fun differently. On the subject of uniforms, though, one of the Facebook pages I'm on, somebody was asking about uniforms on the Waterloo campaign because they had seen a picture of the 13th Leger, so French light infantry, painted in green jackets. And I'd never heard this before, but there's a historian called Paul Dawson, or is it Lawson? Lawson, who has a series of books about the period and has done a lot of research with army museums and archives. And it would seem that our sort of expected knowledge that we all have about French at Waterloo might not actually be as accurate as we think, and there may well have been one light infantry regiment in green. So that'll be an interesting painting project, I think. My own personal painting projects are kind of on the back burner at the moment. Busy with these commissions for the summer. These Prussians are part of a large ongoing project that has been going for a few years now, actually. And there's lots of work to be done. It is hard to justify time on my own projects. But I did buy myself a bunch of Perry Spanish a couple of months ago now. I did a video review on the Spanish boxes, and I have plans to convert them into quite a few of the German units of the Grande Armée in 1813. Some are just paint conversions, occasional French head mixed in. But it's quite far down the list of priorities for me at the moment. I saw recently that Warlord Games are offering their mystery boxes again at 100 quid a pop. You can land yourself a Napoleonic army from them. I think you get almost double the value of what you put in, which I hummed and hawed about and thought, well, you know, if I get more French, that's fine. There's always room for more French. So I could get some British, and really, apart from a skirmishing force for sharp practice, I don't actually have many British models. Or possibly more Prussians, which I need for my 1813 force. But I decided that I'll save my pennies because it's potentially just a purchase that goes into the massive pile of shame and never comes out. I was talking about piles of shame with one of my friends recently, and I think if our better halves knew how many models there are waiting to be painted, we'd all be in trouble. Hopefully, neither of them are ever going to watch this stream back. I think in the stream last time, one of yours was talking about models from a manufacturer called Fizzer Johnson. It's a new one on the market. Started a couple of years ago. I painted some of their models when they were starting out for their website, and they are producers of 18mm figures, and their ranges really complement the AB models. Sort of fills a couple of gaps in the AB range. If there's one tiny criticism about the AB range, is things like cuffs are really up to you to paint the details on. There's no sculpted buttons or anything like that. While those details are perhaps not completely necessary at this scale, the Fizzer Johnson models do have a bit more embellished, sculpted details on them, and they're a bit easier to paint. I noticed that they have recently launched a range of 18mm Austrians. So if you don't have the wherewithal to shrink down your piano miniatures 3D prints to 18mm, you could also look at Fizzer Johnson instead of AB. So in the chat, Tom says, have you managed to compare 3D printed and metal from the same company? If so, are 3D printed any better regarding detail? So I have painted metal and 3D prints from Piano Wargames, not of the same models. So I can't give a direct comparison, but certainly I've painted elements from their range. I think that the metal casts are lovely. They're really smooth, very well cast. I think there are a couple issues with some of the castings that I've had where there's been sort of metal infills on areas. And that's probably because they've been designed for 3D printing. But in order to cast things in metal, you need to have undercuts, and you can't just have the gaps that you might have with 3D prints between sort of ends of weapons and arms and things. But these are issues not just with Piano Wargames figures, but a lot of metal figures. When they're sculpted, there's kind of limitations built in because people know that the casting manufacturing process can't do all sorts of detail. They're lovely though. Really, really clean casts in metal. And I think as an option for somebody that doesn't have a 3D printer, which I would include myself in because I don't have one, I think the Piano Wargames metal casts are comparable with the leaders in the industry as far as Napoleonic figures go when you're talking about metals. Cost wise, they're kind of comparable, maybe a little bit more. For those of us outside of the EU, then there are going to be some shipping charges and potential customs charges to pay, which might ramp up the cost a bit. But definitely a good investment. Hi Clive, you're lurking in the background playing Jitterbox, printing some arrows in barrels tokens for Wars of the Roses Lancastrians. 3D printer is hard at work, it sounds like. Is this a Hail Caesar force that you're putting together? I think you mentioned on the last chat. I think a 3D printer is something that I will get eventually. I don't have the space or the setup suitable for having one at the moment. Bonking one in my bedroom or the kids' bedroom doesn't sound like the best idea. And I don't have an outside space big enough to house that at the moment. So maybe later in life, or if I come into a big pot of money, I might be able to have the space for one. I do think that the future of wargaming is kind of going that way. And I think in an increasingly challenging world to ship and receive things, and being able to buy STL files to print yourself is definitely one way to avoid the vagaries of international trade rules and problems with containers going on boats and then not arriving. I think a lot of wargaming is such a cottage industry that there's always going to be demand for models in metal. I think it's kind of interesting that historical wargaming seems to have sort of skipped the cast resin phase that a lot of fantasy and fantasy and sci-fi stuff did. People thought metal was getting too expensive, so they tried resin. I know Warlord have kind of been championing that as an alternative to metal figures, but a lot of other companies have gone straight to digital design and 3D prints instead. Time to get some more blue on my tray. So dark Prussian blue. I've got a little ball bearing in here. So it's always worth a quick shake up. Just mix things. I'm just using a old-fashioned plastic palette today. No need for a wet palette, no blending, anything like that. I think when I'm doing sort of a batch painting approach, that I'm not worried about maintaining a color to come back to this another day. If I start with a color, I will be finishing everything that needs that color in one session. So hopefully this painting of the jacket has sort of demonstrated where to put the paint. You might notice that I'm not doing all the way to the end of the cuff. I'm leaving some space there for the cuff color to go on. I'm doing a little horizontal blue line, and that just represents where there's not so much a flap on the cuff, but sort of a split in this sort of design of jacket. On the back, we've got straps over either shoulder that need avoided. I'm trying to avoid the collar and the hair, which was all long and all tied back. There's a shoulder strap, which again would be in the facing color. And then I try and paint up to the line of the turn back and not go over it too much. I'm using a cheap Pro Art size 1, all synthetic fibers, which is good for blasting through base coating. I do like using synthetic brushes for sort of mass quick jobs, and also with contrast type paints, speed paints, what have you, because I've found that the sable brushes, the sort of wicking effect of the contrast type paints up into the ferrule really knackers them quite quickly. So I save my sable brushes for fine detail work. Right, last blue jacket to do. The way the client has set up his battalions is that I'm painting sort of 2 battalions of a regiment. The first battalion is in march attack pose as an officer on a horse, and then the second battalion is in firing pose. I think it's nice to have a bit of variety through an army. I think from a painting point of view, march attack is a bit quicker because your muscle memory comes into play when you're painting everybody in the same pose. I think when you're playing sort of mass Napoleonic games as well and you're moving lots of troops, I think that march attack is a bit easier to shift around the table, especially if you have perhaps a French force or an Austrian force and you've got lots of attack columns or battalion mass type arrangements. If you've got everybody in a firing line, as soon as you move them from line into column, you end up with guys poking each other, poking their friends in the back with their bayonets. Doesn't look quite right. Or skirmish type games, firing line is quite nice though. Okay, so that's Blue Jackets done. I'm going to jump over to their skin. I'm using Speed Paint Peachy Flesh to lay down a really quick base coat for this. Again, another ball bearing in there shaking up. I like in Army Painter's recent offerings, their Fanatic range and the Speed Paint range, that they have the ball bearing in there when you purchase it. I think it makes their paints even better value. You don't have to buy separate ball bearings, and you don't have to spend the time taking lids off and mixing them up. Dropping the balls in to do the mixing up. It just happens automatically for you. I've been slowly growing my collection of speed paints. I'm really getting on with them very well. There's a while I was using contrast paints from Games Workshop, but there's a couple of their colours were just a bit too sort of pastel and washed out. Some of their paints take so long to mix up. You definitely have to have a ball bearing in there, but you can be shaking things like Dark Angels Green or Space Wolf Grey for minutes to try and dissolve all the pigment back into the solution. It's not ideal. I went for Vallejo Express when they came out, and I was pretty happy with them until one day I applied a brush on matte varnish, Winsor & Newton Galeria, or Galleria. Really useful stuff, really nice matte finish. But I applied it over the Express paints and everything reacted and ran. And I was really disappointed by that because they had sort of sold themselves very loudly on the fact that their paints didn't reactivate. They did that off the basis of Army Painter's Speed Paint 1.0 having a huge problem with reactivation. I never bought into them because I was using contrast paints at the time. So I skipped the first generation of Army Painter Speed Paint. But what's really good about the Army Painter is they seem to take feedback from customers on board, and they're not afraid to just go, yeah, you know what, we made a mess with that launch. We'll try it again. And so far, Speed Paint 2.0, I've not had any problems with reactivation, even with that brush on varnish. It's been fine. And none of their colors suffer from the Games Workshop problem of all settling at the bottom of the pot and needing minutes of shaking. Everything mixes up pretty well. And they also do metallic speed paints as well. Because one downside of the other ranges is that whenever you want to do metallic, you have to bust out the traditional acrylic, and then probably you need to get a wash and shade it. But if you're really firing through units, having the ability to speed paint everything is really useful. The little faces on the AB figures are superb, really nicely sculpted. And it's that kind of deep detail for like the eye sockets that takes a wash or a speed paint contrast type paint, whatever you're using. It takes it really well. I will end up giving the skin a highlight later in the painting process. Probably not on camera today. But for anybody that just wants a one and done, out the bottle, great flesh. Well, great flesh for white dudes. Then the speed paint peachy flesh is really good. Clive says, my comments seem to go missing in chat. Yeah, I don't know if you've been typing anything else, Clive. It hasn't come through since your last message about your Lancastrians. That one worked. I'll try again. Yeah, that's fine. So I don't know what's been going on with the previous ones. As I'm doing this, I'm wondering if a topic for a future video might actually be how to batch paint, because I see time and time again a lot of painting guides online are, here's a single model, we're going to make it look really good under the camera, repeat this 10 times for your squad, but they never actually sort of talk about the conveyor belt process. And I think it's a really useful skill to have if your aim is to paint armies rather than individual models. And I mean no disrespect to some of the fantastic painters out there who give guides to making incredible single miniatures. But I think for a lot of people in the hobby, especially in the historical side of things, it's about getting big units painted quickly. And you can let the basing and the flags and everything catch the eye. Clive says, Lucas, we're talking about piano war games again, creates STLs specifically to create masters for metals. He releases the STLs to fund the creation of the molds. Everyone is a winner. Yeah. I think he's got himself a great business model and he's developed a lot of fans really quickly. I just painted up some marshals and aide-de-camps for a French force, somebody else's French force, and they were lovely models to do. The horses are so good. They've got a sort of correct balance between size and elegance, and the proportions just seem a lot better than some other manufacturers out there. I don't know, it's maybe something to do with like the shape and the length of the neck, I think, is what can make a horse look good or bad. And the piano war games ones seem to be just on the money. Thomas says, that sounds good, as I paint singular. And Mark says, I only batch paint 4 at a time, if you can call it batch painting. So yeah, maybe I will do a video on how to set up for a batch paint-a-thon to get through a set really quickly. All right, I'm now grabbing a contrast paint, despite me slagging them off recently. So Black Legion is a very black. Black Templar tends to have a bigger difference between sort of highlight and shade It's pretty grey at the tips of the highest points, whereas Black Legion does have a sort of more uniform black appearance. I will be highlighting this with simple acrylics later, but I'm finding more and more that when I paint dark colors like blacks and very dark browns, the speed at which a contrast type paint just applies to a surface, and if you've got the right one like Black Legion, it just leaves such a quick uniform finish that it's easier to apply than an acrylic out of the pot. Just to come back to Mark's point about I only batch paint 4 at a time, if you call it batch painting. Yeah, I don't know where the cutoff is between a, what shall we, like a batch and a couple, a few. I don't think it really makes much difference. I would say that 4 could definitely be a batch. And if you're doing a gun crew, perhaps that's 4 models. You paint them all up in a group. And sometimes you will have just slight uniform differences. That would mean there would be no point in slapping down 16 guys if everybody's wearing a different thing. If you're doing other periods of history, like you're painting Landsknecht or something, the point is the variety. But you can sort of do a modified batch where you perhaps do yellow trousers on one, yellow sleeves on the next one, yellow feathers on the hat of the third one. Clive's last batch was 45. I have to batch paint, otherwise I forget how I did the previous ones. Yeah, I have a number of documents where I list all the paints that I use and what order that I do things in. It's useful for jogging the memory, but when you're painting other people's models, it's especially important because if you're asked to add to an army and you can't remember what you did, things might not match. But 45, I'm trying to think what's the biggest batch I've done. 28 mil anyway. I think I probably have done a 72, so like getting 3 battalions of 24. But you do run the risk of burning out, I think. And you're not always getting that gratification when you're doing a huge number of blue jackets. You never seem to get any closer to the end goal. Mark says, if I'd have loads to be painted, I lose my mojo. Yeah, exactly. It can be disheartening to look on an ocean of primed models and think, oh, I don't know if this is going to be worth it at the end. I think motivation is definitely different for each painter. My motivation at the moment is I'd like to make my mortgage payment. So I'm painting other people's models, and that's my aim. I think something is, having a deadline because you've got a battle coming up, or you're desperate to buy the next thing, so you have to finish what you've got. It can be a good motivator, though that doesn't really stop anybody just adding to the lead pile, does it? So what am I doing with the Black Legion? I am picking out hats and hair, boots, and there's cartridge boxes on the musketeers towards the end here. I'll get to them. I'm doing a base coat on the scabbards. Now these would actually be red leather, but I'm doing the black sort of a shade. I'd like the finish of the red leather to be a bit darker than if I applied it straight over the white base coat. And it means that I don't have to apply the red leather right into the deepest recesses. We've got that nice shadow effect from having the black there first. The bicorn had lace around the top edge, so I'm avoiding that as best I can. Nice to have a brush with a decent tip, and you can get into the gap between the front and back of the hat. Everybody's got tiny little sideburns to try and pick out. This adds to the challenge a little. Yankee Wargamer says, impressed at how you avoid the lace. Thanks. It's practice, I think, has given me the fine control. It's not the end of the world if you go over it, because you can always get some white out later on and pick that out. But just a little bit of extra care at the moment means one less paint out the pot later. So maybe saves a bit of time in the end. Flavio Peroni says hi, nice to see you. Thanks for tuning in. Clive says, I find it works the other way. If I can see my pile of shame as I'm painting, I lose interest. I now tend to batch paint one colour at a time, one particular item on the models. It saves so much time in the long run. Yeah, switching between areas on the model just with that one paint means you don't have to get the bottle out again later. But it's interesting you say about your pile of shame makes you lose interest. I wonder what psychology is at work here with all our piles of shame, whether it's the same for everybody. Be an interesting experiment for psychologists to run one day. Flavia says, ciao, said do 15mm to 28mm bolt revital. Nice work. I can translate that just about. Thanks. 18mm is okay. I think 18mm sits in this weird spot between 15mm and 20mm. 50mm, I almost think of as purely for mass battle. It's the models, well, depending on who you get them from, the level of detail is just enough to be like the right shape of hat, but nobody is painting them to be, completely perfect scale representations. You can take more shortcuts. And I sort of class them in with like your Warlord Games 13.5mm or 10mm, 6mm. You can use darker base coats and rely on black lining to have the effect of showing the areas around straps or where weapons and hands meet. But 18mm, the sculpts are detailed enough that you're almost working as hard as you would with a 28mm figure to pick out the details and use the same sort of painting approaches. I mean, this just might be a personal thing that I find, but I know that to get the 18mm looking really good, it takes quite a bit of work, surprisingly, in comparison to their smaller, slightly smaller brothers. Clive says, "Pile of shame. You should see the STL files. I haven't even started to print yet." that's all. Yeah, that's a 21st century wargamer problem. I've got a bunch of STL files for some post-apocalyptic stuff that I shared with somebody that I know that has a 3D printer. I printed some terrain off for zombie game, Last Days. I got mine through Humble Bundle, who usually do computer games, but they also do books and STL files and things from time to time. And yeah, that's an enormous folder of things that I will probably never ever print, but I can see how it rapidly builds up. And that's with not having a 3D printer. So if you do have one, the temptation must be to just hoard stuff. Get Bash Carnage has tuned in. It's obviously impressed with what's going on. That's a nice bunch of emojis. Thanks very much. I'm glad today that I managed to get the stream to launch without crashing at all. On my first attempt at going live, I had my stream scheduled, and then I did the wrong thing on my phone, and instead of starting the scheduled stream, I started a totally different one. So all the links that I'd sent out to people didn't work. But everything seems to have switched on today okay. Only thing I'm annoyed a bit about is being in vertical mode instead of horizontal on my phone. But maybe I need to invest in a webcam if I want to do this properly. Right, so this strip here has had all the areas picked out in Black Legion, beginning to come together. The cartridge boxes have a nice plate on them. I'll pick that out in brass later, but just going straight over the top of the Black Legion is a quicker way to do it, and it shades it, fills in the detail. So a dry brush of brass later will pick out the raised bits. I will come back and put the hair in brown and then leave the Q, the tied back bit, in black. Officer might have had a powdered hair effect going on, so maybe light grey to pick that out. I will highlight these black areas later as well. A couple of different colours. I've got Eshin Grey from Citadel, and a very fine edge highlight of Cold Grey from Vallejo Game Colour. But that's for much later in the process. Get Bash Carnage says, "I know the feeling. I'm the same when I try to go live, but technology not my friend. Lol." Yeah, I'm sure I will get better at it with practice. And I didn't really mean to. Well, I meant to go live when the first time I did it, but it was just all of a sudden there was an opportunity. The house was empty, and I'd been thinking about it. I was in the middle of the job, and I thought, you know what? I think I'm just going to stream this. Why not? What's the worst that could happen? And it wasn't terrible. It wasn't perfect, but nothing caught fire, and some people watched, so it was a worthwhile endeavor. today was another happy instant of the house being empty, so I could do this without fear of interruption. But I really will try and get a regular live stream going. Negotiate something with the family to have a spare couple hours a week. I don't know if it'll be Sundays. Family stuff usually on a Sunday. I was excused this week. So it's more likely to be a weekday, which is not ideal for other people because work and everything else, but I can guarantee the rest of the family is out or otherwise occupied on the weekdays better than weekends, which don't tend to follow a plan. There is one downside of using contrast type paints, is that if you're a little bit sloppy with the brush and it gets onto a surface you don't want, it will just flow all over it. And when you're doing the hats, that tends to mean it rolls down into the eyes. Not the end of the world, but it can sometimes mean a repaint is necessary in the base color and then pick out the flesh once again. Now, for fans of the Napoleonic period, just this week gone was the 210th anniversary of the Battle of Waterloo. And I've kind of, well, to give the full story, about 6 years ago, I partook in the Great Game, which was what was its full title? Battle of Waterloo Replayed, the Great Game, which was hosted at the University of Glasgow in 2019. I was doing a master's degree at that point in Glasgow and leapt at the chance to actually play some toy soldiers. And I took command of some French light cavalry. Basically achieved nothing on the battle, but I did have some units left at the end, so I survived, but again, France didn't win. It was a fantastic day. It still kind of seems bonkers that I was part of it. I think it was like over 20,000 28mm figures on the table and played using black powder rules. The point I was going to make is that it's 210 years since Waterloo. After playing in that game, I had zero interest. I thought I would never want to do the 100 Days campaign again because I've kind of done it in the biggest way possible. But in recent years, I have actually been warming to that period again, and I'm more interested, I think, in sort of Quatre Bras or Ligne and the stuff from the preceding days. I also read recently about the rest of the campaign that everyone kind of forgets about. There's a few sieges after Waterloo, and some interesting ones where there was like Bourbon forces versus the French under one of the marshals after Napoleon had been beaten at Waterloo. So there's lots of potential there, I think, for slightly different wargaming, even if I don't line up and repeat the Waterloo itself. Clive says, I was there too. I had the first Hanoverian Brigade. Darren says, I've seen that game on YouTube. It was a big game if I remember. Yeah, Battlefield was so large it was fought over 5 75-foot tables, says Clive. Yeah, it was enormous. Obviously, once in a lifetime, I think. I think Tony Pollard, the historian who organised it, had the need for an extreme rest afterwards, and I don't know if he, as much as fun as he had, I don't think if he fancies running one again. First Hanoverian Brigade. So whereabouts on the battlefield was the first Hanoverian Brigade, Clive? Who were you fighting against? My 4th and 9th Chasseurs Cheval bizarrely were very near to La Haye Saint for most of the day. Because, yeah, charging buildings with cavalry is always a good idea. Oh, you must have been on the other side of La Haye Saint, right? Yeah, I was kind of to the, I say to the right of it. I guess that would have been to the east of it. My chasseurs got attacked by some Dutch heavy cavalry and ran away. The other campaign in 1815, which could be quite colourful, is between Naples and Austria. Neapolitan army, I think, has some of the best, brightest uniforms of the whole period. And of course, they had a reputation for being terrible troops. And I am certainly a terrible general, so I could always just blame it on the quality of my soldiers if I had a Neapolitan army and got trounced all the time. Clive says, at the beginning of the day, 2 of the 24 battalions of Old Guard turned up directly opposite me. Yeah, unlike in real life, the Old Guard actually got stuck in from the very beginning. I think the so the approach of all the French commanders was, yeah, reserves. Who needs reserves? And everything just went forward as fast as possible. I think the Prussians that were coming in behind at Plancenoit basically strolled in and maybe had a couple of battalions of Young Guard to deal with, but the rest of the Young Guard was also charging up the battlefield towards the British lines. Darren says, enjoy tutorials, very helpful. Thank you. I'm glad that they are useful. I was partly inspired to start this channel because I realized as I got more and more into doing historicals is that there's a little guidance out there, but a lot of it comes from books and reading, and not everybody has the time for that, and they want to paint and play. So when the pandemic rolled along and I had a bit more time, I decided to record some of the painting processes that I was doing, and they got watched. People enjoyed them, and it really spurred me on to keep going. So I'm glad that they are still useful for people. It makes me happy to know that folk are watching and learning something. For some reason, the French cavalry near Hougemont was ordered to relocate to stop the Prussians. Yeah, there were some interesting orders going around on the day. I think there were some people there who knew how to play black powder, and then there were some people there who fancied themselves as overall commanders with a better grasp of strategy. And you ended up with some people who knew how to win a game of toy soldiers and other people who wanted to sort of deal with the semi-historical outcome of the battle by proving themselves to be better commanders than those on the ground. But yeah, I think honestly, if the Prussians had just been ignored, there would have been a better chance of an overall French victory, because really the key to winning that game would have been to punch through the Anglo-Allied lines in multiple places and march up the board, but alas, it was not to be. I remember Tim of the Napoleonic Wargamer YouTube channel was there, and he does know how to play black powder. And he was trying to tell all the French overall commanders that their advice of deploy into line here or redirect your forces to counter this Prussian thrust was just all a waste of time. Right, one more strip of hats and boots and cartridge boxes to do in black. One painting guide I realize I have never done for the channel, and I probably should, sort of coincides with talking about Waterloo, is that I haven't actually done any British in Belgic shackles, grey trousers, and I really should do something about that. It's been a long time since I've painted any British, to be honest, and when I have done them, it's just been for the Peninsular War. As a travesty, I don't think I've done any guides for any of the Highland regiments in the Napoleonic period. Well, in 28mm at least. I think I did some for minifigs, but that was 15mm. And minifigs, love them, but they don't have huge amounts of detail on them. And the process for doing tartan in 15mm is not the same as 28mm. It's a lot more abstract, that's for sure. So yeah, I probably do need to do some more British painting guides. I don't mind painting tartan, kind of just about worked out how to do the most well-known patterns of the period. But certainly cavalry is something as well that has been repeatedly asked about as a potential source of painting guides, and I haven't done very much on the channel, so I need to fix that. And I don't think I've done any British cavalry, so that may be a video series that comes out soon. Clive says, the old guard player brought his regiments on and immediately formed square. gave the Allies enough time to gather loads of cavalry to bear, and they were kept in the square for the rest of the game. Yeah, perhaps not the best tactical approach there. I think in Black Powder, being in square and keeping in square with a circling cavalry squadron is a really good way to neuter units. The old guard especially, they're so powerful that you should have just ploughed on through down the cavalry. Tartan spray paint, yeah, if only. One of my earliest Napoleonic commission jobs when I was freelancing for another painting service. Oh, when would this have been? I was still in my old flat, so 2012, around about then, was some Perry Black Watch. And I think that was maybe the thing that kind of gave me the kickstart into being a historical player and moving away from the chains of Games Workshop games. That was pretty much all I played at that point. I'm going to switch my lights on because it suddenly got very dark here. I think we're going to get some rain. The weather has been blazing hot towards the end of the week there, but yesterday night, all of a sudden, the rain clouds rolled in. It's still horribly warm today, so I wonder if we're maybe going to see some thunder, unfortunately. Clive says he's had thunder too. I think that I assume you're down south somewhere. I think that Scotland's avoided most of the thunder so far, but certainly there's some spectacular lightning storms I saw footage of online down south. Just over the border from Gretna. Ah, just on the wrong side of the border, you mean? Mark says last Friday in the southeast was like somebody flicking the light on and off. Wow, yeah, extensive light show. If I do suddenly go offline, it's because this has turned into a storm and the power's gone out. Although I'm not out in the sticks, I can still run the risk of power cuts in Inverness. I had one a few months ago. It was only a few minutes at a time, but still quite annoying. Darren asks, what is your most favorite unit in Napoleonic that you enjoy painting? Oh, that's a question. I think my this is going to sound silly, but my comfort blanket, the unit that I can just sit down, relax, and paint, and not have to think too much about is probably French infantry in the 18 post 1812 Bardan regulation uniform. I mean, that's really just because I've painted so many of them that I don't have to think about where the piping goes or what the colors are. So that's kind of my happy place when I'm painting them. I think that sometimes I do enjoy a challenge. So the aforementioned Highlanders painting the tartan, it's not an easy process, but the end results look great. I'm now trying to think if I have a least favorite unit that I've ever painted. I think there are certainly some challenging uniforms in some of the sort of minor nations, where there's such variety between battalion to battalion that it's very difficult to sort of get into a flow state. I think some of the Duchy of Warsaw uniforms are like vastly different. Not you can't even use the same models for figures that lined up, in the same battles of each other as each other. Different cuts of coat, as well as different colours, and some in shapkas and some in shakos. So that can be quite annoying because you can't just remember. You have to look it up every time. Hussar units are always challenging to paint, especially if they've got sort of patterns that need to be painted onto the saddle cloths, or some of the Russian Hussar units need wolf's teeth actually painted onto the flat cloth. Other sort of guard cavalry units from both the sort of 1806 period, Prussians, and guard cavalry from sort of Austerlitz era Russians, the saddlecloths there have got really intricate patterns in the borders, which I've done for a client at one point. That was really challenging. And I think sometimes that you have to accept that you're not going to be able to replicate the actual pattern, because even in full size on a horse, it's a work of art by the weaver that's done it, and trying to replicate that in 28mm or 18mm is just too difficult. Clive says, good thing about Duchy of Warsaw is the historical record is pants. So many contradictions, it doesn't matter if you get it wrong. Yeah, I suppose that is one way to look at it. That in fact, that's kind of true of sort of quite a few armies of the period. But I think especially with the Polish units, Duchy of Warsaw and the Vistula Legion, it's just not written down. So there is a lot of conjecture in places. Dan says, yeah, I'm doing some Italians on 28mm, 2nd Battalion, testing my patience. But a great challenge. Figures are Elite Miniatures 1812. Elite Miniatures are so charming. They've got that very old school, almost kind of tin toy soldier look about them. Everyone's quite slim. And I love how so many of like the officer figures have their sort of chin pointed skyward, quite aloof looking. I've done plenty of elite miniatures for other people in the past, and they have a real sort of something about them that you don't see in many other current manufacturers. I think Italian second. Well, the Italian uniforms, of course, you've got different facings between each regiment. But I think the Perry, I want to say the Perry French 1807, 1814 box has a guide to the Italians on the fold out insert that's in there. And there is also a website called Napitalia, which is really useful for the Italian uniforms. Yeah, Characterful is right when describing elite figures. Mark asks, how many figures do I paint a month? Ooh, that's a good question. So with this Prussian commission of 18mm figures, I am trying to paint at a minimum 2 battalions a week. So that's 48 figures times 4 is 160, 184 18mm figures in a month. Also, so far this month, I have done a couple of French in 28mm, a couple of French marshals on horseback, some ADCs both on foot and horseback, and finished off a Zouave drummer. Got him here for the American Civil War. He's going to feature in a upcoming painting guide video. Wheats, Tigers, Louisiana Zouaves with their fantastic stripy trousers. What else have I done this month? I think I finished up the Piano Wargames Austrian stuff in May, actually. So yeah, it kind of, if it's all 28mm figures, I would at least be trying to do a battalion of 24 a week. So 100 plus 28mm figures. And then that number can go up and up and up, just depending on how busy my schedule is and what I can fit in. 6 months work for me. Yeah. Well, if I'm talking about how many of my own models I paint in a month, it's somewhere between about 0 and 6. Finding the time for your own stuff is challenging when this is your day job. I have had some months where I've been incredibly productive, but it depends on a lot of factors. What's going on with family life. I've got other stuff going on. I'm stupidly trying to do a PhD at the moment, so that's another part-time concern of mine. But the painting is a good way to have a flexible way of earning money that can fit around many other things. I wonder if there are people out there who paint full time. I wonder how many figures they would get through. I bet there are some people who are churning out like a battalion of 24 in 8 hours work, 6 or 7 days a week. It wouldn't surprise me. Okay, so I have finished the black hats there. I'm going to grab some heavy sienna. It's a real shame that this the Game Extra Opaque range is now defunct from Vallejo. This is a really nice brown, covers excellently. Once this bottle runs out, I might not have any more. So this is my color I'm using for wood. So our NCO here has a nice big pole arm partisan type thing. He also has a stick for keeping the men in order. Sticks for the stick is for keeping his hands out of his pockets. Yeah. Keeps everybody on side. If you could have any range of figure / genre produced, what would it be? So is that in terms of a range that doesn't exist, or asking a particular manufacturer to do a range that they don't do? Anything to exist that doesn't exist. Oh. I think there's a sort of a shortage of some periods of Scottish history which are quite interesting. Like I'm not aware of a good sort of just here's an army for the Battle of Flodden in the early 1500s, sort of Scottish or English. I think you'd have to know the period really well, and know about armor types and so on and so forth to be able to get a good representation of that kind of early Renaissance period. Duchy of Berg would be Clive's choice. Don't know if enough people would buy it though. I think with Berg you can kind of get just about get by with French, and also the new Perry Spanish give the sort of German cut coat. But yeah, I mean, there's always small differences like shackle plates and cuffs, which aren't exactly correct if you're substituting in French models. Neapolitans. Yeah, again, just slight differences in sort of shackle plates and scalloping on cuff flaps and things like that. Now, there is a company, what they called Novocast, who have done the Neapolitan 5th Regiment, which is the regiment that's just made up entirely of black soldiers. I would imagine that they have plans for expanding that for some of the other Neapolitan regiments. I'm particularly interested in seeing some of the Neapolitan light infantry in gaiters for my 1813 project. I could again use some sort of French and Bardan uniforms, but if they were to produce actual Neapolitan light infantry, I'd be very interested. Prospero, thanks for tuning in. Full range of AB Ottomans. Yeah, Ottoman and Wargaming doesn't seem to go together very much. So there's a limited Perry range, but considering how many battles between the Ottomans and Russians took place, there's just not a whole lot available out there for the average wargamer. With Berg, it's the cuffs, twin shoulder belts, and epaulets. That's a problem in converting. I did this for 1812. Absolutely right. It's just not quite right if you're using the French. Passable up to a point, but not exact. I've had another think of something that I would love to see, which is somebody to do full ranges for the Battle of Austerlitz in plastic in 28mm. You kind of use the Victrix French and Austrians for that period, but those kits are very fiddly, and they're not actually that useful for army building. You end up with lots of extra officers in the French one, and a real hodgepodge mix of poses. And nobody does Russian infantry in plastic for that period, and the uniforms are really different in comparison to sort of 1809 Russians onwards. Again, lots of things about pom-poms being different per regiment. So yeah, I think more Scottish specific historical periods would be great. But in terms of sort of big mass battle Napoleonics, I would love to see the Battle of Austerlitz possible in plastic. Don't think the Perrys will ever tune into this, but if anybody knows them, give them a nudge. Even if they were to do some early period Russians in metal, it'd be a start. I know that the I think Brigade Games do some, and they're US based, and Casting Room Miniatures in the UK, which is sort of a little sister to Foundry. AB do a great range in 18mm, but 28mm is a bit lacking. Yeah, I imagine, Clive, it must be really satisfying to get a force made up from humble beginnings like that. Yeah, the Perrys were there at the Great Game. I was a bit too starstruck to go speak to them, which sounds ridiculous, you know, but I'm just a big fanboy, I suppose. I've just realised that I forgot to do the musket straps in brown as well. The Prussian army of this period, everyone had a red leather musket strap. So I'll finish the wood on these ones and go back to the others. There's quite a few wargaming luminaries at the Great Game. I'm sure Rich Clark of Two Fat Lardies was one of the umpires. Does anybody have a wargaming period, or I suppose a historical period they find really interesting that could be wargamed, but nobody else seems to be interested in it at all? I am kind of fascinated by some of the sort of wars that almost happened but didn't quite, like the Pig War, which almost broke out between British and US forces in the gosh, 1840s, 1850s. Somebody's pig on an island that was contested between what is now British Columbia and sort of north of Seattle in what is now Washington State. Almost led to a shooting war, and I think that could be an interesting what if. Maori Wars in New Zealand, where I live, painting some at the moment. And the Emu War, yeah, classic Emu War, yeah. It's not somebody did, was it an April Fool's gag in 6mm? They did the Emu War. They might even have ended up producing the models. So I have visited New Zealand, and I'm a little bit aware of sort of the sort of colonial period there. But I think that the Maori Wars were a bit interesting because it was one of the few times where the sort of local resistance had experience with musket-based warfare, because a lot of the tribes had been fighting amongst themselves with European weapons for a long time. And unlike most other places where the redcoats rolled in, the resistance to them was very firm and organized. And the way sort of Maori architecture and village defenses worked was actually quite good against cannons. That's my understanding anyway, but please correct me if I'm wrong. Thanks for tuning in, Mark. Thanks for watching, getting involved with questions. Always happy to waffle. Please come back if I do this again. Yeah, I'm going back to correct my mistake where I forgot to paint the musket straps with the brown. That's Darren confirming that defences at the Maori villages were clever. Wow, coming up to an hour and 45 of streaming. Not quite sure how long I intended this to last today, but if everybody's still watching, then I'll keep going. I have really been struck with some wargaming nostalgia recently for 1990s era Warhammer 40,000 figures. Sort of stuff that I had when I was a kid that I didn't paint very well. I'd love to take another crack at them now with the skills that I've developed over the last 30 years. But it's finding the time. I quite like the sort of retro old hammer movement that you see in places like Instagram and Facebook. I think it's a lot of people who are just about hitting 40 like I am or older finally get the chance to indulge in the hobbies that they couldn't really do very well when they were younger. You're welcome, Darren. 1:30 a.m. over there. Yeah, enjoy work as much as you can, and yeah, thanks for the best wishes about the PhD. It's a lot of hard work, but it's nice to do something like painting to both relax and pay the bills while I'm doing that. So thanks for tuning in. Hopefully see you on the next one. Does anyone else have nostalgia for a certain part of their hobbying life they would like to revisit someday? Perhaps right the wrongs of a inexperienced paintbrush and repaint something, or take a new project on again to recreate the glory days. I am particularly interested in getting some old Eldar figures out, so Games Workshop Space Elves, um, from the early 90s. I still think that their character designs from that period stand up, and have never been improved upon in the 30 plus years since they were originally released. I'd love to have the opportunity to repaint some figures from that period and see if I could do something approaching the quality of the ones that used to be in the books and magazines back then. I think tackling a totally different project is a good thing because it helps to sort of provide a bit of a palate cleanser. And that can be important if you're tackling the same sort of figure for a long time. What's your PhD in? Well, it's related to serious games, so using games to provide educational information and training, but video games as opposed to traditional or board games. But certainly, historical war games are a great way of teaching people about history. So there's a bit of overlap in my interests and what my PhD is in. But commission painting is a fantastic little side gig to have, because it can fit around so much other stuff, and I'm not sort of shackled by the need to be in an office 9 to 5 at the moment. This can be done evenings, weekends. And also, painting stuff is quite relaxing for me, so it helps keep me relatively sane amongst it, the hard work. Tom says, very true. I was a senior teacher for quite some time, and I used to use similar games when I was explaining. But back then, it was games by SSI, not the type of graphics we have today. Yeah, and sort of the stuff I'm working on is definitely not going to be graphically heavy. And I've got to take considerations of what's the power of the average PC in a computer lab in terms of what graphics can it support. And also, a lot of students are going to be accessing things on mobile or tablet, so chances are it's going to need to be a browser-based game. So not very graphically demanding, and in order to deliver sort of the right learning outcomes, it's probably going to be a sort of a old school text adventure type thing. And Clive was introduced to wargaming while he was in the army due to stuff from an attic. I think the military, still very heavily involved in using wargaming to teach all sorts, and not just in the traditional put your blocks on the table, here's your men, but also for working out how to do many situations that the average soldier might face in the day to day. Right, time to do the facings on these models. I mentioned earlier that this is the Konig Regiment, number 18. And going for a kind of deep pink color. And interestingly, certainly according to the Perry's graphic, this includes the turnbacks, whereas turnbacks for most of the other regiments were all in red. I'm guessing Konig is King's regiment, and maybe they had a slightly different uniform because of that. The color that I'm using now, I've had to mix up myself to get something that looks almost correct. So it's a mix of Old Rose and game color Warlord Purple. It's about sort of 1 part Warlord Purple to 3 parts Old Rose. So it's collars, lapels, cuffs, and turnbacks to pick out. On the rank and file soldiers, there's also the shoulder strap to do as well, but that's not present on the officers or NCO uniforms. I find it kind of funny when I've got such a ridiculous number of paints, and then I tried to find something that matched this facing color, and it just didn't exist in all the many hundreds of bottles that I have. I've got quite a few purples, quite a few pinks, but just nothing that was approaching this sort of wine, rosé wine, sort of not quite pink, not quite purple. But again, it's another reason for writing down your paints that you're using in any particular project, so that if you revisit this many years in the future, you can just refer to your records and everything will match. That's Thomas saying in the chat. Yes, we used to use it quite a bit when I left school. I joined the Royal Green Jackets, and we used to use figures and vehicles. They would set up scenarios for us to work out. I think it's proven time and time again that games are a great way to learn. my work is in, well, my research is for higher education purposes. And there is kind of a bit of elitism still, that games are for children and that once you reach university, they're no use. But hopefully, my bit of research will help add to the growing body of evidence that playful learning is really useful, no matter the age group. The Royal Green Jackets were the Roumont Battalion in the Falklands when I was there in 84, 85. Well, so we have veterans watching us today. I was born in 1985, so I certainly was not there in the Falklands. Just overspilled a bit there onto this drumstick, so clean my brush off, and a wet brush will lap up the paint. Now the drummer has bird's nests on his shoulders. I'm trying to leave a white outline there. I'm fairly certain that all the drums would have a red band, but I will double check that for the Conic Regiment. I'm just wondering now if, because I don't have red turnbacks, that the drum rim might be in this facing color, but I will check that later on before committing either way. I'm just thinking back to my little mistake, my little overspill of paint that I did on the drumstick. I just followed that up with another one there. I think one thing that maybe doesn't get shown in painting guides is that you know, mistakes happen, and it's part of the painting process. I think a lot of people get hung up on correcting every single little mistake as soon as it gets done. But quite often, when it comes to sort of the highlighting stage when painting, you can just tidy up your errors then. For example, I have paint splodges all over the straps on quite a few of these models, but I'm just going to leave them because after the wash stage that I will do on these models, the straps are going to need to be highlighted back up to an off-white color, and it doesn't make much sense to me to do that twice. So that is something that I will just save to the highlighting stage towards the end of the painting process. What's the chat saying? Clive says General Peter de la Belliere was the GOC. Now, this is where I don't know my military acronyms. When I was there, I was entering one of the coastals one day and he came striding out the main door with his staff running behind him. He's a big fella. When I finally saw the brass and realized who he was, I stood to one side of the walkway I was on and threw one up. I'm assuming you mean a salute and you didn't actually vomit as he went past. Right, we've hit the 2-hour mark, and I think I might need to go take a break. So I think this will be the end of today's stream. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. It's been nice to chat and paint at the same time. And that little throwing up or saluting instant was Clive's the proudest day of his military career. So congratulations on saluting the general. So yeah, thanks for tuning in, everybody. It's been nice to talk today. I think it's good for me to do a bit of socializing online while I'm painting, and hopefully you've enjoyed watching as well. I intend to keep up with these streams. I think weekdays will probably be a bit easier for me because I can have a more regular streaming schedule. I'm not relying on other people being out, which is what happens on Sunday sometimes, and I can just leave online. But I know for other people it's more useful to know in advance when these streams are going to happen. So I will get planning, try and make these a regular thing. It's been really great to stream today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see everyone soon. Bye for now.